Hello. In this video, I want to demonstrate a new feature introduced in Worklight 6.2, which allows using Worklight authentication framework to protect third-party services, web services, and basically any types of URLs. Okay, so before we dive in, I actually want to do a quick introduction to this feature to explain what this feature really is all about. So basically, Worklight 6.2 allows using Worklight authentication framework to protect third-party service. What does it mean? So any security test defining authentication config, okay, can be used to protect an external service. Usually, you define security tests that protect your Worklight artifacts like adapters or applications. But now you can define a security test that will be used to protect external service that is not hosted by Worklight server. Worklight server in this case will issue an access token, okay, that will identify authenticated user, device, and application. And this access token will be signed by a Worklight server, and it will contain the application, the user, and device identities, as defined, of course, in the security test configuration, and it will also contain the expiration timestamp. So the external service will actually know how long this token is allowed to be active. Okay, so Java and Node.js server-side libraries are provided by Worklight to be used on third-party services, enabling them to, first of all, protect services with security tests defining authentication config. Then check incoming request and ask client-side to authenticate with a Worklight server for a specific scope. And in this case, scope is equals to security test. It's synonymous. And of course, the libraries Worklight provides will allow to validate access tokens, making sure that they were really issued by a correct Worklight server. Okay, so in a nutshell, flow looks like that, right? First, your client application, which contains Worklight SDK, right? It makes an external request to some kind of external service. This external service has a Worklight authentication filter installed in it, okay? And this external service can be either JEE or Node.js server, right? So authentication filter filters this request, detects that this request is not authenticated yet, it doesn't have an access token, and returns HTTP 401 supplying authentication scope. Okay, so in your client code, in application client code, we provide a utility method that will allow actually to detect that 401 with the authentication scope was returned, right? And then using Worklight SDK, you can actually invoke obtain token for a scope API, right? Obtain access token, and this API will go to the Worklight server. Now, on a Worklight server, and remember, scope means security test. Each security test contains realms, right? And as you know, realms return challenges. So in order to authenticate within a realm, you first receive challenge. So once you request access token for a specific scope or security test, you will get challenges from relevant realms. From here on, the flow is absolutely Worklight standard authentication flow. You receive challenges. It can be either adapter authentication, custom authentication, form-based authentication, any type of authentication. And you return challenge responses, for example, your username and password. So once you authenticated within a security test within the scope you've requested token for, you will get your access token. Okay, so you will get this access token in your code. So in your listener success callback, you will get this access token. But in addition, Worklight client, Worklight SDK will cache this token, so it would be easier for you to retrieve it next time you need it. Okay, so token is basically a value you need to insert in your HTTP header, right? So next you do once again you issue the original request, but this time you issue it with token, right? Authentication filter sees that this token currently within this request can be found, right? Then it validates the token, making sure that that's the authentic token. Indeed, it comes from Worklight server, and in case everything is okay, it returns HTTP 200 with response. Right, so the flow looks a little bit complex, but the truth is it's absolutely not complex, it's very simple. So once again, you make a request, and the external service saying, nope, I need a token first. You go into Worklight, going through regular Worklight authentication flow. Eventually, it's kind of similar to invoking procedure. Eventually, you're getting access token, right? It's some kind of a long string. And from now on, all requests to your external service that is protected by a Worklight authentication filter, you need to add this token. So Worklight server will actually let you in, okay? So, several things. First of all, we'll go through how to install authentication filter and token validation. We will create certificate that is used by workload server and by third-party server to actually authenticate that the token is authentic, that it comes from the real workload server. Right? We'll create a basic web application and protector with protect it with authentication filter, and then we'll create a workload application. This part, the client application, that will actually do those round trips. Okay, so in order to gain this functionality, Workload 6.2 client-side contains native iOS, native Android, and JavaScript APIs for working with access token, obtaining access token from workload server. So APIs are similar on all environments. The first one is obtain access token, and you need to supply scope or security test that you actually want to obtain token for, and callback or listener on token received. Next, you have a utility method get last access token. So in case you've already got it before that, right, you can just retrieve the cached version. Okay, so you have also utility API get last access token for specific scope. So in most cases you will be working with a single scope, but in case you have multiple scopes, you can get last access token for a specific scope. And one more utility API, get required access token scope from HTTP status and authentication header. So this is a utility function I was talking about. It actually helps you to parse HTTP status and authentication header returned from the server side to understand whether this is indeed coming from workload authentication filter. Okay, so we will implement all of this in a moment. We will use all of this functionality in a moment. So once again, first we'll make request to the external service. It will return some kind of a 401 with authentication scope, then round trips with workload server for obtaining token, and eventually making the original request, but this time with access token. Now the first step would be creating a new certificate. So I've already done that. So in order to create new certificate, you can use Java key tool command line utility or any other utility you prefer, right? So this is what I've used, a key tool. I've created a new key, new certificate with alias mycert. I've stored it into keystore.jks file with password mypass, validity 1000 days, and key size 2048. So some fake data, right? And basically the certificate was created inside of keystore JKS. Okay, so this is the key store that will be used in Workload Studio. Okay, for actually when Workload Studio, when Workload Server will create the access token, it will use the private key from this certificate to actually sign this access token. So now the external server actually needs to know how to open this signed, how to validate the signature of this signed access token. That's why we're going to, next step would be to export public key from the certificate, right? And this public key would be saved on a external server. So once again, I'm using key tool. I'm exporting from keystore JKS alias mycert to file certificate.cer. Okay, so eventually I have two files. I have keystore JKS, right? That's my key store that will be used by Workload Server, and certificate CR, that's the file that I'm going to put into my external server, right? So now let's go to Eclipse and see what's going on here. Okay, so I have an Android application, a pure native Android application, right? I have a Workload project with authentication adapter because I'm going to be using adapter authentication. Okay, and I've already created a native API for Android, called it my Android app. Okay, and used all of the files, already copied them. So pretty much I have everything ready. Okay, so now let's see what is the configuration that I need to do. So from the Workload Server perspective, first of all, keystore JKS. That's the file I've created in previous steps. So I've copied here, and I've modified workload properties, and I've defined that my workload default certificate, that CA certificate authority workload uses, will be taken from this key store. Okay, so keystore JKS, keystore type JKS, password mypass, alias mycert, and alias password mypass. Okay, so from now on, workload will use a certificate from this key store, okay, to actually sign access tokens. Good. Next step is to actually create security tests that will be used to protect my external resources. So here I'm once again creating a simple custom security test, and you have to remember this security test will not be used by your workload application or adapters. This security test will be used on external server. Okay, so I'm creating a custom security test. I'm naming it sample security test, and I have a new property which I can define as access token expiration in seconds. So this access token issued for this security test will be valid for 1 minute, for 60 seconds. So I'm using a sample application or sample app realm as my test, right? And defining it as an internal user ID. Sample app realm, that's very basic adapter authentication. I'm not going to go through details of how adapter authentication works. There is a separate documentation on that. So basically adapter authentication with login and logout functions stored inside of my adapter. Okay. Good. So now the idea is to use sample security test to protect my external service. Okay, let's see how it works. I've created a regular web Java application, right? And I'm actually running it on a Tomcat, on a local Tomcat, okay, custom local Tomcat installed in my developing environment. Okay, so it's a very basic application. It contains just a handful of files. So first of all, I've copied here a certificate cert file. That's the public key of the certificate that I've created in previous steps, and that's what's going to be used by external server to actually validate token. Next, there is a lib folder, right? And here you can see Worklight Access Token Validator jar. That's basically the functionality of Worklight server, the Worklight authentication filter, the token validator, etc. If you want to know where to find it, go under your Worklight project and open External Server Libraries folder. That's where you have your Worklight Access Token Validator jar for JEE servers and Worklight Access Token Validator second file TGZ for Node.js. So you just need to drag and drop it, simple as that, okay, under your libs folder. So next, my web XML file. So my application name is protected web application. I have a index.jsp file, going to go through it in a moment, okay, and here I'm defining a filter. So I will call it WL filter. It will use class com workload security WL access token validator filter. That's something defined here in this jar file, right? You need to copy it in order for this to resolve. So there are several initialization parameters. First is workload certificate file, and I'm mapping to certificate.cr file. That's the file. The root is web.in folder. And another one is scope. So the scope for this filter is sample security test. And remember, that's the scope or security test with defining authentication config. Sample security test. That's the same. So once I've created my filter, I'm adding a mapping. So this filter will protect, well, pretty much everything on my server. So /store, it will protect pretty much everything on my server. That's it. My server is configured, and my server is protected by Worklight Access Token Validator filter. So if I open index.jsp file, first of all, if I'll try to go to that file from web, if I'll make HTTP request to get this file, I will not get it until I'm authenticated with Worklight, right? But once I am authenticated, once I will get these files, this file you will see if you see me, you're authenticated. And also Worklight provides you, as I said, token contains information about user identity, application identity, and device identity. So in this case, I will just display user ID I used to authenticate. Okay, so client context, that's coming from com Worklight security client context class. Okay, package, get instance, and get user. So I'm getting my user information here. Okay, as simple as that. So that's the server side. Now let's see how the thing works from a client side. So first of all, I have my Android application. Okay, I'm going to go through my application code and see what it does. So first of all, let's see how the UI looks like. Okay. So there are 4 UI elements. First one is call protected HTTP. That's the button that's going to invoke my protected web application, right? Then I have kind of username and password fields, which is currently set to work late because that's what my adapter is expecting, okay? And then I have a login button. So this is the button that will actually go to work-late adapter and do logging, okay? So that's the UI. So in my activity, I have button invoke HTTP button login button to edit text for username and password. I have a reference to my work-late client, and since I'm going to get challenge from work-late server, I also have a reference to challenge handler. Okay, that's something I will create. So now let's see. My application starts. I'm setting content view, setting UI, setting title, finding views by IDs, binding the views to the, well, referencing the views, creating the work-late client instance, right? Creating new challenge handler, right? We can go through challenge handler code later, but it's a regular adapter challenge handler, nothing special there. And registering my custom challenge handler. Okay, so now things starts to be interesting. Invoke HTTP button. That's the button that will actually invoke HTTP to my protected web application. So let's see what it does. Since you cannot really make HTTP requests, and I try to be as simple as possible on the main thread, right? We're creating a new thread. So creating new default HTTP client, that's from Apache packages. Creating new HTTP GET request, that's the URL, that's my local URL, and protected web app, that's the URL of my running Tomcat. Okay, and next step, it's already something new. So here in request, for the request, I'm actually already setting header. Even before I got something, I'm already setting header, authorization, bearer, and I'm getting last access token from work-late. Okay, so initially on first request, this will be null. Okay, work-late doesn't yet have last access token. So basically, server will see that I already have authorization header, right? But the value is invalid. So it's pretty much similar to not having anything at all, right? But I will show you in a couple of minutes why it's a good idea to actually add this here on this early stage, right? So this is the header that will actually authenticate you, that will actually tell your external server that you've already authenticated with work-late. Now let's see. I'm telling my client to execute request, getting a response. I'm getting HTTP status from response. I'm going to output everything to the log. Request finished with status, request finished with body. I want to see status, I want to see body. And in case my response contains authenticate header, okay, so this is the header that actually should tell me to authenticate. I want to output it as well, right? So the rest is currently commented out because I just want to see what happens. So let's start my application, emulator. Okay, that's my basic UI, right? I'm invoking, pressing call protected HTTP. Good. I'm getting request finished with 401. There is no body, right? Because I haven't received any data, so it's just request finished. And the header is bearer scope sample security test. So this is basically the scope or security test I really need to authenticate with in order to be able to access this resource. Okay, so I'm also getting invalid token because, well, this token is invalid. It's currently null. Okay, good. So I've tried to access my protected resource, and work-late filter intercepted request and said, hey, you need to authenticate with sample security test first. So we're made this request, and we got this request, 401 plus authentication scope. Now let's see how do we detect scope. So first, convenience API is actually WL client get required access token scope. So you supply your HTTP status, you supply your authentication header value, and work-late client will actually extract this piece sample security test for you. So here, as an output, as a return value, you will get the security test name or the scope name, sample security test. Good. But you cannot be completely sure that this request is coming from Worklight. Maybe you have something else in the middle that also can return 401, okay, and can return some kind of a different authenticate header. So in this case, the get required access token scope will just return null. So in case it's anything but Worklight, that's anything but a payload that's coming from Worklight filter, it will just return null. So in next step, I'm actually checking in case my token scope is not null. I'm calling my WL client API, obtain access token. Token scope, that's something that I already have, right? I'm going to Worklight to obtain my access token, and I'm supplying my WL response listener, right? So let's see, my WL response listener, that's pretty much a very basic class, regular Worklight response listener. It implements on success and failure and just outputs the result to the log. Okay, not doing anything specific, anything magical or whatever. Okay, good. So once again, I'm making request. Request returns 401 with authenticate header. I'm using Worklight API to actually extract from this header the scope that I need to authenticate for. And in case it was successfully extracted, I'm going to Worklight asking for access token. Let's see what happens next. So as I've said, we're going to do obtain access token for scope. That's the function, obtain access token. And we're going to get challenges. Why? Because, well, my client is not yet authenticated into this sample app realm and security test, right? So if I run my procedure now, right, I'm also getting a log output from my challenge handler. So basically, that's the payload I'm getting from adapter, and that's basic adapter authentication sample. So let's just for a second take a look at the adapter. So it would make sense. If I'm not authenticated, I'm getting auth required true. The username is hard-coded Worklight and the password is hard-coded Worklight. And once I'm authenticated, I will get back also required false, right? So very, very basic adapter authentication, hard-coded credentials, just to demonstrate, okay? So once again, authentication required true, authentication required false, and credentials are Worklight. Okay, so as you can see here, I got error message null, auth required true. So custom response true, and I'm into the handle challenge function. So basically that's the standard Worklight authentication flow. I'm inside of my handle challenge function, and I've actually used this function to disable this button and to enable the rest of my UI. So I've already pre-populated username and password field, so let's make it wrong. So if I'm having a wrong username, clicking login, you can see I'm getting error message invalid login credentials, and authentication is still required. So let's see what happens when I'm giving right credentials. I'm clicking login. Okay, a lot of information in the log. So let's see it step by step. First of all, I got in my custom response authentication required false from adapter, which basically means I'm currently authenticated. Okay, so in challenge handler, let's go to the challenge handler. In case authentication required is false, I'm doing submit success. And submit success basically means that the Worklight client need to issue original request again. So once again, I'm got my challenges, right? I've answered those challenges. I've submitted my credentials. We'll show it to you in a minute, all right? So login button. Okay, that's my login button. Okay, and it does submit credentials. Submit credentials is a very basic function. It takes username and password from boxes, username box to password box, creates Worklight procedure invocation data with adapter and procedure name hard-coded, sets parameters, and does submit adapter authentication. Regular adapter authentication flow, nothing extra. Okay, so and once I'm authenticated, I'm actually doing submit success. So once my challenge responses are processed by Worklight server, and Worklight server validates that everything is fine and returns me authentication no longer required. I'm making original request, and eventually Worklight server will return me the access token which I've asked for here. I've asked for access token, I've done the authentication flow, I'm getting the access token. So as you can see here, is custom response is trying to process the response, and here in my WL response listener, that's the function, that's the no, not this one, that's the response listener I've defined for my invocation. I'm actually getting a lot of JSON for scope sample security test, token type bearer, and then access token, a lot of gibberish, a big string with a lot of data, right? So technically, already here I can extract this data from response and save this token somewhere, right, and use it in all my subsequent responses. But my code is already prepared for this case, and I do not need to do it manually. Why? Because as I've said initially, Worklight client will make sure of caching this token. So you as a developer would not need to actually manage it yourself. So as you recall, once we create our request, we're always adding a header, authorization, bearer, and getting last access token. So when we did our first request, there were no access token yet obtained from Worklight server. So in this case, yeah, the request failed. But since we're doing it again, right, and we've already obtained access token, get last access token will actually get me the right access token. So this time, this request shouldn't fail. It should actually be successfully completed. So let's see if that's the case. So I'm calling protected procedure. Okay, yeah. Need to scroll down. Yeah, okay. And as you can see, request finished with status 200, request finished with body. That's the HTML I've defined. If you see me, you're authenticated, and user ID is actually detected correctly, Worklight, because that's the username I've defined. Okay, so if I restart my application, just okay, I need to close it first. So if I restart my application to demo the flow once again, so this is application calling protected HTTP. Oh, it still remembers the token. It still thinks I'm authenticated. Let's kill the application. Killed. Okay. So my Android application. Okay, let's clean logcat, call protected HTTP. Once again, 401, need to authenticate. Authentication interface is enabled. I'm clicking login, getting an access token, and this access token is cached by Worklight. So once I click call protected HTTP again, I will actually get my data, because right now I'm already authenticated. Okay, so once again, first request is getting me 401. I'm using Worklight utility API to actually detect which scope I need to get token for. Obtain token for scope, challenges, responses, and eventually I'm getting my access token, and now I'm doing my request with token, right? And since the external service token validation endpoint knows how to validate this token, since we're using the right certificate store and public key, I'm getting 200 with a response. So I hope this was useful, right? And I hope now you will be able to protect your own services with Worklight server.